Thomas Brennan froze mid-sentence, his weathered fingers trembling above the typewriter keys. The cabin's silence shattered as visions flooded his mind, orange flames licking at wooden walls, smoke choking his lungs, his own voice screaming for help that would never come. The manuscript pages scattered like dying leaves as he saw himself trapped, burning. His pen slipped from his grasp. Death had shown him its face, and it wore the mask of fire. The autumn wind howled through the towering pines surrounding Thomas Brennan's isolated cabin in the remote forests of northern Montana. At 62, the former best-selling novelist had retreated from the world 3 years ago, seeking solitude to write what he hoped would be his masterpiece. His graying beard had grown wild, and his deep-set brown eyes held the weight of countless untold stories. The cabin sat on a ridge overlooking a valley where the nearest neighbor lived 2 miles away. Thomas had chosen this place deliberately. No distractions, no interruptions, just him and his words. The old log structure creaked in the wind, its single room divided by necessity, a writing desk by the window, a stone fireplace for warmth, and shelves lined with books and manuscript pages. Chapter 27, he muttered to himself, rolling a fresh sheet into his vintage typewriter. The keys clicked rhythmically as he typed, the sound echoing in the stillness. Outside, storm clouds gathered, promising the first snow of the season. As Thomas wrote about his protagonist's final confrontation, the world around him suddenly shifted. The familiar surroundings of his cabin dissolved, replaced by something terrifying and immediate. He wasn't seeing through his character's eyes anymore. He was seeing through his own, but in a future that hadn't yet arrived. Flames danced across the wooden walls of his cabin. The smell of burning pine filled his nostrils. Smoke, thick and choking, poured from the fireplace where embers had somehow escaped. His manuscript pages were already curling and blackening in the heat. He could feel the scorching air against his skin, hear the timber groaning as the fire consumed everything he had worked for. In the vision, he stumbled toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. The frame had warped in the heat, trapping him inside. His voice cracked as he called out, knowing no one would hear him in this wilderness. The fire was too fast, too hungry. As consciousness began to fade in the vision, he saw his life's work reduced to ash. Thomas gasped, snapping back to reality. His heart hammered against his ribs as he stared at the innocent fireplace, currently holding nothing but cold ashes. The typewriter sat silent before him, the half-finished sentence still waiting. But the terror remained vivid, the heat, the smoke, the desperate struggle for breath. He stood on shaking legs, walking to the window. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and treacherous. Had it been a dream? A hallucination brought on by too many solitary hours. But the details were too precise, too real. Thomas knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the approaching winter, that he had just witnessed his own death. The premonition haunted Thomas for hours. He paced the cabin's confines like a caged animal, his eyes constantly darting to the fireplace. Every creak of the old logs made him jump. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching danger. By evening, he had made his decision. He would leave immediately. "I won't let it happen," he said aloud, his voice echoing in the empty cabin. "Not like that." Thomas began gathering his most precious belongings. The manuscript, nearly 800 pages of his life's work, went into a leather satchel first. His journals, photographs, and a few essential clothes followed. As he packed, he kept glancing at the fireplace, remembering how the flames had seemed to originate there in his vision. The wind outside had grown stronger, rattling the windows and sending pine needles skittering across the roof. Thomas checked his watch, 8:30 p.m. Too late to drive the winding mountain road safely, but he couldn't stay here another night. The vision felt like a countdown timer ticking in his head. He loaded his truck, an old Ford pickup that had served him faithfully through 3 Montana winters. The engine turned over reluctantly in the cold air, and Thomas waited for it to warm up while his breath fogged in the cab. As he reached for the gear shifter, something made him pause. A memory surfaced, his neighbor, Bill Crawford, mentioning that he'd be away this week, visiting his daughter in Billings. The other neighbor, Mrs. Henley, was elderly and lived alone. If there really was going to be a fire, if other cabins were at risk, shouldn't he warn someone? Thomas sat in the idling truck, torn between his desire to flee and his conscience. The vision had been so specific, so real. What if running wasn't enough? What if the fire would spread, consuming the entire ridge? He thought of Mrs. Henley, probably asleep by now, trusting that her quiet forest home was safe. The ethical weight of his premonition settled on his shoulders. He couldn't just save himself. He had to try to save others too. But who would believe such a story? How could he explain a vision of the future without sounding insane? Thomas made his choice. He would drive to Mrs. Henley's cabin first, find a way to convince her to leave for the night, then continue to the main road where he could call the fire department from the general store as payphone. It might be a false alarm, but the alternative, living with the knowledge that he could have prevented tragedy, was unthinkable. The drive to Mrs. Henley's took 15 minutes on the narrow forest road. Her cabin showed warm light in the windows, and smoke rose peacefully from her chimney. Thomas parked and approached the door, rehearsing what he would say. How you tell an 80-year-old woman that you've had a psychic vision of fire? Mrs. Henley? He knocked gently. It's Thomas Brennan, from up the ridge. I'm sorry to bother you so late. The door opened to reveal a small, silver-haired woman in a quilted robe. Her kind eyes showed concern at the unexpected visitor. Thomas? What's wrong, dear? You look terrible. I need you to come with me, he said carefully. There might be danger tonight, a fire risk. I think we should both get to town until morning. Mrs. Henley studied his face, perhaps seeing the genuine fear there. After a moment, she nodded slowly. Let me get my coat. As she gathered her things, Thomas felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he could change the future. Maybe the vision was a warning, not a prophecy. But as they walked toward their vehicles, a new dread began to creep in. In trying to save others, was he somehow ensuring his own fate? Thomas led the way down the mountain road, with Mrs. Henley following in her small sedan. The headlights carved narrow tunnels through the darkness as they descended toward the valley town of Pine Creek, 15 miles away. The road was treacherous, even in good weather switchbacks and steep grades that demanded complete attention. Halfway down, Thomas noticed something wrong. His truck's steering felt loose, pulling slightly to the right. He gripped the wheel tighter, compensating, but the sensation worsened with each turn. Then he saw it in his rearview mirror, Mrs. Henley's headlights weaving erratically behind him. A chill ran down his spine as he realized what was happening. This was another trap, another way death was trying to claim him. In saving Mrs. Henley, he had put them both in danger on these deadly mountain roads. Thomas pumped his brakes gently, testing them. They felt spongy, requiring more pressure than usual. His heart rate spiked as he recognized the signs brake fluid leak, probably. How had he not noticed this during his hasty departure? But he knew the answer. In his panic to escape the fire, he had skipped his usual vehicle checks. Behind him, Mrs. Henley's sedan lurched toward the guardrail. Thomas watched in horror as she overcorrected, her car fishtailing on the narrow asphalt. The elderly woman wasn't used to night driving on these roads, and fear was making her erratic. Thomas pulled over at the next safe spot, a small turnout overlooking the valley. Mrs. Henley stopped behind him, and he could see her gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. "What's wrong?" she called out as he approached a car. "Mechanical problems," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice calm. "My brakes are soft, and this road is too dangerous in the dark. We should call for help." Mrs. Henley fumbled for her cell phone, then shook her head. "No signal up here? Never is." Thomas checked his own phone, the same. They were in one of the many dead zones that plagued the mountain region. The nearest landline would be at the ranger station, another 8 miles down. But getting there with failing brakes would be suicide. "We'll have to go back," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Back to the cabins?" Mrs. Henley looked confused. "But you said there was danger." "Less danger than these roads with bad brakes," Thomas lied. He couldn't tell her the truth, that returning meant walking directly into the fire he had foreseen. But staying here, or continuing down the mountain, would likely kill them both in a car accident. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to escape his fate, he was being forced back toward it. Every choice seemed to lead to the same destination: death. They turned around carefully, Thomas leading at a crawl, riding his emergency brake and engine compression to control speed. Each curve was a negotiation with gravity and momentum. Mrs. Henley followed, her sedan's headlights shaking as she struggled with the unfamiliar road conditions. As they climbed back up toward the ridge, Thomas noticed something that made his blood freeze. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, was an orange glow. Not the warm yellow of electric lights, but the angry red-orange of fire. The vision was beginning to manifest. "No," he whispered, pressing harder on the accelerator despite the brake problems. "Not yet. We're not back yet." But even as he raced against time, Thomas knew the truth. The fire hadn't been caused by his presence at the cabin. It had been inevitable. The vision hadn't shown him how to prevent his death. It had shown him exactly how futile his attempts to escape would be. The glow grew brighter as they approached the ridge. Mrs. Henley's cabin came into view first, still intact but with smoke visible against the stars. Thomas's cabin, however, was already gone, consumed by flames that reached toward the black sky like grasping fingers. His manuscript, his life's work, everything he had tried to save it, was all burning. And somehow, he knew his story wasn't over. The worst was yet to come. The fire had spread faster than Thomas could have imagined. What had started as a few glowing embers in the distance was now a wall of flames stretching across the ridge. His cabin was completely engulfed, the heat visible even from a quarter-mile away as waves of distorted air rose into the night sky. "Dear God," Mrs. Henley whispered as they pulled up to her still intact cabin. "How did it start so quickly?" Thomas stared at the inferno that had been his home, remembering every detail of his vision. The manuscript pages curling and blackening, the wooden walls crackling as they burned, the smoke that had filled his lungs. But he was here, outside, safe for the moment. Maybe the vision had been wrong about the details, even if it was right about the fire itself. "We need to get your important things and leave," Thomas said urgently. "The fire will spread to your cabin soon." Mrs. Henley nodded, hurrying inside while Thomas kept watch on the approaching flames. The wind was driving the fire toward them, and he estimated they had maybe 20 minutes before her cabin would be in immediate danger. But as he stood there, truck engine running, ready for a quick escape, he noticed something troubling. The road behind them, their escape route, was no longer clear. Falling burning branches had created obstacles, and worse, he could see another fire line starting in the valley below them. They weren't just facing one fire. They were being surrounded. Mrs. Henley emerged with a small suitcase and a cat carrier. "Chester wouldn't come out from under the bed," she explained breathlessly. "I had to drag him out." "Good," Thomas said, but his attention was fixed on their deteriorating situation. The fires were converging, creating a trap that seemed almost intentional. How could this be happening? Forest fires didn't usually move this strategically. As they loaded her belongings into his truck, Thomas realized with growing horror that the road they had just traveled was now blocked by flames. A massive pine tree, weakened by fire, had fallen across the narrow path. They were trapped on the ridge with nowhere to run. "Thomas," Mrs. Henley said quietly, "look." He followed her gaze upward. Above them, the sky was raining embers like deadly snow. The fire was so intense now that it was creating its own weather system, pulling burning debris high into the air and dropping it miles away. Mrs. Henley's roof was already collecting glowing spots that would soon become new fires. "The cellar," she said suddenly. "My cabin has a root cellar. Stone walls, separate entrance. We could wait there until help comes." Thomas nodded, though he knew help wouldn't arrive in time. The fire department was volunteer-based and an hour away under good conditions. With the roads blocked, they'd have to send helicopters, and night flights over a forest fire were nearly impossible. They moved Mrs. Henley's things to the cellar, a small underground room accessed through exterior doors behind her cabin. The space was cramped but solid, carved into the rocky hillside with thick stone walls. As they settled in with flashlights and the terrified cat, Thomas felt a strange sense of déjà vu. This wasn't how his vision had ended. In the Premonition, he had died in his own cabin, trapped by a warped doorframe, overcome by smoke. But his cabin was gone, and he was in a different location entirely. Had he successfully changed his fate? The sound of flames grew louder, accompanied by the crash of falling trees. Through the small cellar window, Thomas could see Mrs. Henley's cabin beginning to catch fire. The roof was already smoking, and flames licked at the wooden siding. "Will we be safe here?" Mrs. Henley asked, her voice barely audible over the roar outside. Thomas wanted to reassure her, but honesty seemed more important now. "I don't know," he admitted. "The walls are stone, but if the fire gets too intense, it could consume all the oxygen." They sat in silence, listening to the destruction above them. Thomas thought about his manuscript, 800 pages reduced to ash. All those words, all those characters he had brought to life, gone forever. But then he looked at Mrs. Henley, holding her frightened cat, and realized that some things mattered more than stories. Maybe that was the real message of his vision. Maybe preventing his own death hadn't been the point. Maybe saving her had been the purpose all along. But as the temperature in the cellar began to rise and smoke started seeping through the cracks around the door, Thomas began to wonder if he had simply delayed the inevitable, bringing Mrs. Henley down with him into a different kind of death trap. The stone cellar had become an oven. Despite the thick walls, heat radiated from the burning world above, and smoke was finding every crack and crevice. Thomas and Mrs. Henley pressed damp claws to their faces. She had grabbed towels during their hurried packing, but the air was becoming increasingly difficult to breathe. Chester, Mrs. Henley's orange tabby cat, paced restlessly in his carrier, sensing the danger even through his feline confusion. The animal's distress seemed to mirror Thomas' growing realization that they had merely traded one death trap for another. "I need to tell you something," Thomas said, his voice hoarse from the smoke, "about how I knew the fire was coming." Mrs. Henley looked at him through watery eyes. "I wondered about that. You seemed so certain, so frightened." Thomas explained his vision, the premonition that had shown him burning alive in his own cabin. As he spoke, Mrs. Henley listened without judgment, perhaps because their current circumstances made supernatural warnings seem less impossible. "So you saw your own death," she said when he finished. "But here we are, alive in a different place entirely. Maybe you changed it?" Thomas shook his head. "Or maybe I just changed the details. The fire still came. We're still trapped. And now I've dragged you into it too." A tremendous crash shook the cellar as something heavy fell on the cabin above, probably the main roof beam. Sparks and debris rattled down the stone walls, and the smoke grew thicker. Thomas estimated they had perhaps 30 minutes of breathable air left, maybe less. "There might be another way out," Mrs. Henley said suddenly. "The previous owner mentioned something about a tunnel. Used to be a mine shaft, I think, before they built the cabin." She led him to the back corner of the cellar, where a section of the stone wall looked different, newer, rougher. Thomas ran his hands along the surface and found loose stones that could be moved. Behind them was a narrow opening, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. "It might lead nowhere," Mrs. Henley warned. "Or it might be blocked further in." Thomas peered into the darkness with his flashlight. The tunnel extended beyond the beam's reach, carved through solid rock. The air coming from within felt cooler, less contaminated with smoke. "It's our only chance," he said. They gathered their essential items: flashlights, water, Mrs. Henley's medications, and Chester and his carrier. The tunnel was claustrophobic, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees through sharp rock. Thomas led the way, trying not to think about what would happen if the passage narrowed further or ended in a cave-in. After what felt like hours, though was probably only 20 minutes, Thomas saw something ahead, not light exactly, but less absolute darkness. The tunnel was opening up. He emerged into a larger space, a natural cave that smelled of mineral water and damp earth instead of smoke and death. Mrs. Henley followed, breathing heavily but alive. Even Chester seemed calmer in the cooler air of the cave. "Where are we?" she asked. Thomas explored with his flashlight and found another opening, this one leading outside. They emerged into fresh night air on the far side of the ridge, well away from the fire. The flames were visible in the distance, still consuming everything in their path, but they were safe. As they sat on a boulder, catching their breath and watching the distant inferno, Thomas felt a mixture of relief and confusion. His vision had been so specific, so detailed. He was supposed to die in that fire, trapped and helpless. But he had escaped, had saved Mrs. Henley, had cheated death itself. Maybe the vision was a gift, Mrs. Henley suggested. A chance to change things. Thomas nodded, but something nagged at him. The vision had felt so real, so inevitable. And there had been a detail he hadn't mentioned to her in the premonition. His pen had fallen from his hand as the flames consumed him. But his pen was back at the cabin, buried now under tons of ash and collapsed timber. As if responding to his thoughts, Thomas reflexively reached for his shirt pocket, where he always kept a writing pen. His fingers found nothing. The pocket was empty. In the chaos of evacuation, of saving Mrs. Henley, of fleeing through tunnels, he had lost his pen, the same pen he had seen fall in his vision, the same pen he had used to write every word of his manuscript. A chill ran through Thomas that had nothing to do with the night air. Maybe he hadn't escaped his fate after all. Maybe he had only delayed it. Dawn was breaking over the mountains as Thomas and Mrs. Henley made their way down to the main road. The fire had burned itself out during the night, leaving behind a blackened wasteland where the ridge community had once stood. Fire trucks and emergency vehicles were finally arriving, too late to save the cabins, but ready to help any survivors. Thomas felt hollow as he surveyed the destruction. His home, his work, his entire life for the past 3 years, all reduced to charcoal and ash. But Mrs. Henley was alive, and that had to count for something. Maybe his vision had served its purpose after all. A paramedic checked them both for smoke inhalation and minor injuries. Thomas's lungs burned, and his hands were scraped from crawling through the tunnel, but he was fundamentally intact. The physical examination revealed nothing immediately life-threatening. "You folks were lucky," the paramedic said. "Most people don't survive being trapped in a forest fire like that." Lucky. The word felt strange to Thomas. He had cheated death, had outwitted a supernatural warning, had saved an innocent life. By any measure, he should feel victorious. But the missing pen troubled him. Such a small detail from his vision, yet its fulfillment felt ominous. Mrs. Henley was talking to a Red Cross volunteer about temporary housing when Thomas noticed the news van arriving. A reporter was setting up, preparing to interview the fire survivors. Thomas started to turn away. He had no desire to be on television when something made him freeze. The reporter was young, probably in her 20s, with dark hair and ambitious eyes. She was testing her microphone, and Thomas could hear fragments of her voice carried on the morning wind. There was something familiar about her, something that made his chest tighten with inexplicable dread. "Excuse me," she called out, approaching Thomas. "I'm Sarah Mitchell from Channel 7 News. I understand you and your neighbor escaped from the Ridge Fire. Could I ask you a few questions?" Thomas found himself nodding, though every instinct told him to walk away. The reporter positioned him with the burned ridge as a backdrop, adjusted her microphone, and signaled to her cameraman. "I'm here with Thomas Brennan, a local writer who heroically saved his elderly neighbor from last night's devastating Ridge Fire," she began. "Mr. Brennan, can you tell us how you knew the fire was coming?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. How could he explain a supernatural premonition on live television? How could he describe a vision of his own death without sounding insane? But as he opened his mouth to speak, something else happened. His chest constricted painfully. His left arm began to tingle, then went numb. The stress of the night, the terror, the smoke inhalation, the physical exertion had taken a toll his body couldn't handle. Thomas Brennan, at 62 years old, with a lifetime of poor diet and sedentary work, was having a massive heart attack. He staggered, his hand going to his chest. The reporter stepped forward in concern, but Thomas was already falling. As his vision darkened and his legs gave out, he saw his pen, the one that had been missing from his pocket, lying in the ash-covered dirt beside the road. It must have fallen out during their escape through the tunnel. The pen fell from his hand, just as it had in his vision. Thomas hit the ground hard, his body convulsing as his heart stopped. The last thing he saw was Mrs. Henley rushing toward him. Calling his name, her face filled with the grief of someone who had just lost the person who saved her life. The vision had been accurate after all, just not in the way he had expected. He hadn't died in the fire, he had died because of it. The stress, the smoke, the desperate flight to safety had pushed his aging body beyond its limits. Death had been patient, allowing him to play hero, letting him believe he had won, before claiming him anyway. As paramedics worked frantically to revive him, Thomas's consciousness faded with one final bitter understanding. His story would never be told, not the 800 pages that had burned in the fire, and not the tale of his premonition and desperate escape. The only witness was Mrs. Henley, and who would believe an 80-year-old woman's story about supernatural visions? The pen lay in the dirt, silent and still, marking the spot where Thomas Brennan's final chapter had ended. His last page had been written not with words, but with the ultimate sacrifice, a life given to save another, even though death had been waiting all along. In the distance, smoke still rose from the ashes of what had once been home. And somewhere in those ashes lay the remains of a story that would never be finished, by a writer whose own ending had been predetermined long before he ever saw it coming. The news cameras kept rolling, capturing everything. But some stories, Thomas realized in his final moments, are too strange for anyone to believe, even when they're happening right in front of them.